Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ash here coming at you today in Clash Royale, and today we're going to talk about one of the most important things in the entire game, and that is building a balanced and winning deck. So on top of that, we're going to discuss a few specific decks I'd recommend, and while this video is going to cater more towards players who are beginners in arenas 1 through 6, it will still hold some valuable tips that I'm sure will help everyone, even if you're of an intermediate or advanced skill level. So let's get right into it here, and be sure you stay to the end, guys, because I am going to share 11 tips to take your game to the next level. But to start to build a great deck, you need a win condition card. A Hog Rider, as you can see here, is a great example of a win condition card. A Goblin Barrel is another one. You could also use the Giant, a Prince, for example, and you could even use a P.E.K.K.A. or even a Balloon. So a win condition card is basically a card that's going to be the main source of your offensive damage. This is going to be the card that's going to win you the games, as the name applies. And what you want to do after you have 1 or 2 win condition cards in your deck, you want to build a complementary cast of cards surrounding it, both supporting it and also helping to defend. So that's going to be the 2 class types of cards that we're going to build around that win condition card. So real quick before we get into some card examples, let's talk about the difference between a support card and a defensive card. Now, support cards can certainly play both roles as supporting your win condition and also defending. But when building a deck, after I picked out my win condition cards, so in this deck it would be the Hog Rider, I like to then select 1 or 2 cards that I'm going to combo with the Hog Rider to support it and take down whatever defending troops, whatever counters my opponent throws at me. So in this deck, my supporting cards are the Fire Spirits, which I'm going to drop at the river, at the bridge, with the Hog Rider, and also the Fireball. But we'll get to the Fireball in just a moment. Some other support cards, they're also cycle cards, are these cheap cards here. Skeleton, Spear Goblin, Goblin. Minions can be a good support card, especially in a beatdown deck behind a Giant, say. And especially in early arenas, a Witch can be a great versatile support card as well, playing the role of both key defender and also a great momentum starter on offense behind your tank. But anyway, let's deal with the deck that we have here. I want to talk a little bit about combos here before we move on to the defensive cards. So when you're building a deck, the first thing you should think about is what type of combo are you going to use as your main offensive weapon. So I have a 3-card combo in this deck: my Hog Rider, my Fire Spirits, and my Fireball. Why the Fireball? Well, the first thing you want to do, no matter what deck you're building, is think to yourself, what is going to be the most common and best counter for my win condition? And in this deck, it might be a cannon or a tombstone, along with, say, archers or a mega minion or something like that. In this second deck here, my win condition is going to be my Giant or my Balloon, and my combo is going to be the Giant and the Balloon with arrows. So why the arrows on the second deck, and why the Fireball on the first deck? Well, it's pretty simple, and it brings me back to my point about counters. Think of what your opponent is going to counter your win condition with. So in this deck, the Balloon most likely will be countered by minions or minion horde. That's why we're using the arrows. Back to the first deck, we're using the Fireball because most likely my Hog Rider is going to be countered by a cannon or a tombstone or barbarians. That way we can use that Fireball preemptively once we learn what our opponent is going to counter our winning combination with. And trust me, there's no better feeling in this game than playing a prediction Fireball or arrows to preemptively counter whatever your opponent is going to throw at you to stop your push. Now you can use the Zap spell in this deck as well. Don't be afraid to have more than 1 spell in your deck. Spells are a beautiful and really strong part of this game. Every deck should have at least 1 direct damage spell. Want more spell tips? Stay tuned to the end of this video because there is a spell tip in my list of top 11 tips. Now, another variation of this deck could be adding speed to the opposite lane. So once you have a deck that you're comfortable with, don't be afraid to tweak and play around a little bit. See if you have better luck substituting 1 card of a similar class with another card of a similar class. So now that we have our win condition all set, what are we going to use for defensive cards? Now, some cards, like I said, can play both roles, such as is Skeleton Army and Fire Spirits. You want to have one, at least one, maybe two, splash or swarm card. So what is a splash damage or swarm card? Splash or area effect damage, such as the Valkyrie here, do a great job at taking down multiple low hit point units that are coming at you. Now, swarm cards such as the Barbarians or the Mega Minions do a great job at stopping those high hit point tanks coming at you. So having one of those two cards in your deck is very, very important on defense. So those are examples of the defensive cards that we're going to use to fill out your deck. Now, a lot of these cards are interchangeable. You want to make sure that you have cards that target both air and ground. So make sure when balancing out your deck, you do factor that in. You need cards that are going to be able to stop anything your opponent could possibly throw at you. Now, the last but not least important card that we're going to have in our decks is going to be a defensive structure or building. So we have the Tombstone in the first deck, the Inferno Tower in the second deck, and the Furnace in the third deck. So when choosing your complementary defensive card or your hut or spawner unit, you want to keep in mind what your deck is trying to do. So in the first deck, Tombstone's a great cheap defensive card that keeps my cycle going. In the third deck, my Furnace here will spawn Fire Spirits, and this is really a bait deck. I'm trying to bait out my opponent's arrows or fireball and then hit them hard with my win condition, which is my Goblin Barrel. So before we move on to the tips portion of today's video, I should mention a couple quick other things about building a balanced deck. Number one is I like to include at least one point damage card. In this deck, it would be the Archers and the Musketeer. Basically, it's an air or ground targeting range card usually that doesn't do splash damage, but it does tend to do a lot of extra damage because it doesn't do the splash damage, thus the point damage. Now, these are very versatile cards both on defense and offense. They're one of the best cards for stopping your opponent's push defensively and then putting a tank down, and they end up being your main offense behind your tank after they stop your opponent in the same lane. So the last thing I want to talk about when building a balanced deck is the elixir cost. I'm a firm believer of the Goldilocks zone for average elixir cost for a deck. I like to have a deck anywhere between 2.9 and 3.9 elixir cost. Anything lower than 2.9, especially for beginners, can be hard to manage because you're playing a lot of cards really, really quickly. Anything above 3.9, it gets a little bit expensive and it's difficult at times to keep up with your opponent's rotation. By the way, what is an opponent's rotation? And what is a cycle? Well, real quick, a cycle is usually used as a verb, cycling, and a rotation is commonly used as a noun, meaning what's in my opponent's rotation right now, or where is the fireball in my opponent's rotation, rather than my opponent is trying to cycle to the fireball. So cycling basically means usually playing low elixir cost troops or cards to try to cycle back to your win condition. So basically you're trying to move to your win condition as quickly as possible when you cycle. A rotation is basically when you want to try to learn what your opponent is doing, you can guess what card might be played next, or at the very least what cards are currently in your opponent's hand, and you do that by counting how many cards they've played since they previously played that card. In a nutshell, if they play the Hog Rider and then they play 4 other cards, you know they have the Hog Rider back in their hand. That's a very important tip for you guys. So speaking of tips, let's move on to the official tips. Tip number 1, the big secret to Clash Royale is your best defensive weapon is your towers. So try to play on your side of the arena as much as possible, especially when starting out the match. Defend and then push. Patience wins matches. Tip number 2, I never like to start out my match with my win condition combo or with an expensive elixir card. This just leaves you too vulnerable to a strong push in the other lane, as your opponent will have a big elixir advantage. Tip number 3, don't level up all your cards. Pick your favorite win condition, support, and defensive cards, and then level them up first. You can always pick up new favorite cards in the future, but gold is a very scarce and valuable resource, and you don't want to spend it needlessly on every card in the game if you don't have to. Number 4, let your opponent make the first move in a match, or at the very least, make sure you wait until you're at 10 elixir before you play your first card. Being reactionary is the best way to start a match. Tip number 5, when your opponent is prepping to make a big push in one lane, say they drop a giant or a golem behind their king tower, always throw something in the opposite lane and make them commit some of their elixir to defending over there. Number 6, when starting a slow push, always place your tank behind your king tower. Never build a push from the river, always build it from the king tower and then stack behind. Number 7, understand what your opponent is trying to do early on in the match. Too many times we concentrate on our own decks and our own strategy and we don't even realize what the opponent is trying to do. Clash Royale is like a chess match. You have to know and understand your opponent in order to consistently win. Tip number 8, don't worry about card rarity. Commons can be just as powerful and useful as some epics. Don't build your deck around just cards that are super rare. Okay, tip number 9. You can watch TV Royale to get some good deck ideas, but beware guys, especially in early arenas, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're good players or that they have good decks if they're on TV Royale. TV Royale is a great tool, but don't rely on it too heavily. There's a bunch of good websites out there, such as ClashRoyaleArena.com, that actually takes approval process to submit a deck, so it's not like anybody can just throw up random decks out there. Find a deck that one of your clanmates is using, or maybe a YouTuber who you look up to, or that you trust for good strategy advice, hint hint, and basically find a deck and tweak it to your own liking. Number 10. This is an important one about spells, and it's don't be afraid to actually use them. I tend to see people being a little bit too passive on their spells. If you have a fireball and your opponent plays a mega minion right behind their tower, and you're already sitting at full elixir, by all means use your fireball to damage the mega minion and damage the tower. Get value out of your spells. They're one of the most powerful types of cards in the entire game. So guys, the last tip is going to be, if you gem, buy giant chests. Especially early on, they're your best value in terms of quickly leveling up your commons and rares, which are really the backbone of any good deck. Alright guys, that's going to do it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you learned a thing or two, whether you're just picking up the game or you've been playing for months. I hope there was a little nugget in there for you guys too. So guys, just want to thank you all for continuing to watch and support my content. I really, truly mean it. So guys, thanks so much for watching, and as always, take care guys.